Welcome to an introduction to educational research, and today's video deals with threats to internal validity. In the previous video, we covered terms which included variables, the independent variable, or the treatment, or the intervention, or the cause, the dependent variable, the effect, what is being measured, extraneous and confounding variables that may offer alternative explanations for the results of a research study, controlled variables, or variables that the researcher should control for, and then we talked about internal and external validity. And the internal validity, that if a research article has high internal validity, we can say with a very high degree of probability, it's probably the independent variable, the treatment that has caused a change in the dependent variable, or what is being measured. Now, over the years, researchers have identified certain extraneous or confounding variables that typically interfere with the results of a research study. And these extraneous and confounding variables that show up over and over again are referred to as threats to internal validity, and threats to external validity also. But this video will deal only with the threats to internal validity. And this video will introduce 11 typical threats to internal validity that you should be aware of and keep in mind when reading research articles. And being knowledgeable about these threats to the internal validity of a research study is important because it'll allow you to detect valid, solid research from poorly done research. So let's take a look at then these threats. And as I just mentioned, internal validity refers to how accurate we can consider the results of a study. How well did the researcher control for extraneous and confounding variables that might offer alternative explanation to the results? If we can infer that the results of a study are accurate or valid, then we can infer that the study has very good internal validity. Now, on your screen are 11 variables that, if not controlled for, may lead to invalid research results. We'll go briefly over each of the threats. In your reading and evaluating research articles, it's a good idea to keep these threats in mind. These will give you a very good way of evaluating research as to whether it is worthwhile in reading and using or not. As just stated, knowledge of these threats will greatly help you in your analysis and understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of educational research. Well, now let's look at the first threat, which is the historical threat. Specific events or conditions other than the experimental treatment may occur between the beginning of the treatment and the end of the research study. And this is referred to as the history of the study. It's from the onset of the study to the end of the study. That distance or that time is called the history. And these events or conditions that are not part of the independent variable or treatment may produce changes in the dependent variable. The term history, as I mentioned, does not refer to past events, but to extraneous events occurring at the time the experimental treatment is being applied. And you can see by the cartoon on your screen, things that happen during the experiment that influence the dependent variable, but are not part of the independent variable or treatment. And it could be many things. Okay, so that's the historical threat to internal validity. Events that are not part of the independent variable that take place. The flu, how about COVID virus? How about that? That's quite a historical threat to internal validity of any studies that have been gone on in the last year. All right, the next one we'll look at is called maturation. Now, the historical threat to internal validity has to do with environmental events that take place during the total history of the study from the beginning to the end. Maturational threats are biological or psychological changes that may occur to participants within the function of the passage of time. So subjects may perform differently on the dependent variable because they became wiser or hungrier or more fatigued or less motivated than they were at the beginning. And there could be many reasons. And these changes in performance affect the internal validity because they may produce effects that could mistakenly be attributed to the experimental treatment or the independent variable. Maturation is especially a threat to internal validity when research is done on children because they are naturally changing very, very quickly. I mean, picture a 6th grade class entering the school year in September and then leaving to go into the 7th grade in June of the next year. Quite a bit of maturational changes will take place, and you can see the cartoon there. Changes on the independent variable due to subjects getting older and smarter, more coordinated, etc. over time. So that's the maturational threat. Another threat to the internal validity is testing. The term testing effect refers to subjects' performance on a post-test score after having taken a pretest. On research designs that use a pre-test and post-test design, subjects may perform better on the post-test as a result of having taken the pretest. And some reasons for these testing effects include subjects may have learned some subject matter from taking the pretest. They may have become familiar with the testing environment. They may have developed a strategy for performing better. They may have become less anxious about the test the second time around. So one of the ways to deal with pretest and post-test is to use different forms. You wouldn't want to have the same form as a pretest and post-test unless the distance between the pretest and post-test was quite large. If you gave a pretest, let's say at the beginning of the school year in September, and then at the end of the school year, the following June, you gave a post-test and it was the same test, then I don't think that the testing effect would interfere very much. But if it were a short period of time between pretest and post-test, then it may become a real threat. So you want to use either equivalent forms. You'll have two forms of the test that are similar, and you'll see that a lot. Or there needs to be a large time interval. So that is the testing threat to internal validity. The next threat is referred to as instrumentation. Change in instruments used during the study can cause an instrumentation threat. Suppose you gave us a pretest, multiple choice pretest, and you gave an essay post-test. Well, the instrument has changed. So that could be a real threat, an extraneous variable, a confounding variable. So you would want to use the same form of instrument. Unreliability of a measurement instrument is another instrumentation threat to internal validity. I think I've mentioned in an earlier video, my doctoral dissertation had to do with developing some software and a remote control device so teachers could collect direct observational data. So there was a device about the size of a credit card, a little thicker, but about the same size as a credit card that the teacher carried around. They didn't have to be near a computer. In fact, the computer didn't even have to be in the room where they were. And they could just click on it and it would collect the data. And it was done in a school for students with autism in 9 different classrooms. 8 of the classrooms, things were going swimmingly, beautifully. One classroom, the data was just whacked out, totally off the wall. So we went over the procedures that the teacher was using, and what we found out is she took the remote control data collection device, and put it on top of a radiator, a metal radiator. And the metal radiator interfered with the transmission of the signal to the computer. And so this unreliable, this interfered with the reliability of the measurement, and it became a real threat to the internal validity of the study in that particular classroom. Once we straightened it out, it was fine. Another instrumentation threat can be when you're using direct observation, when you have observers in a classroom or wherever collecting data. Generally, there's a procedure that they follow. And at the beginning of a study, usually they follow that procedure very well. But then they tend to drift a little bit, become a little lackadaisical, not as sharp, and that becomes a threat to internal validity, an instrumentation threat to internal validity. Okay. The next threat we'll deal with is statistical regression. Now, what this means is if students score extremely high or extremely low on a particular given assessment or test, if they were given that assessment or test again, the tendency would be that those students who scored extremely high would sort of regress toward the mean, and those scores that were extremely low would sort of move up towards the mean. So scores tend to move back towards the mean, extreme scores. So you can see from the cartoon, an individual or group selected on the basis of exceptional scores on one variable is expected to be less exceptional on other variables. They will tend to regress back towards the mean. And that is a definite threat to internal validity, and it's referred to as statistical regression. Another threat is differential selection or selection bias. And this is when participants in the experimental and control groups have different characteristics that affect the independent variable differently. So the groups are not equivalent, and therefore it's not really fair to compare them. And you can see from your graphic there that the population is multicolored dots, but the data that you're using only has red, purple, and yellow dots, which is not representative of the population. So a way to deal with this differential selection, or when you have groups that are not equivalent, is to randomly assign students, if possible. Now, a lot of times research is done in schools and in classrooms. And in classrooms, you cannot randomly assign students to experimental and control groups if you're using 2 or 3 different classrooms. So you may have to use existing classrooms, but you would have to try and control as much as you can that the groups are equivalent, that the classroom groups are equivalent, especially on the dependent variable that is being measured. So that is differential selection. Now let's take a look at mortality or attrition. The experimental mortality or attrition threat occurs when there is differential loss of participants from the comparison groups. In other words, you have, let's say you have a control and experimental group, and students drop out of the study in different numbers. And then that alters the composition of the treatment groups. So you may have started out by trying to make both groups as equivalent as possible, but you get this differential dropping out, and then that violates the principle of equalization of groups, and therefore the results are under threat. So the differential loss may result in differences on the outcome measures, even in the absence of treatment. So here's an example. If several of the lowest scorers on a pretest gradually drop out of the experimental group, the remaining subjects will have higher mean scores on the final measure because the lower scores are underrepresented because they dropped out. Maybe they got bored or it was too difficult, but the low scores dropped out. So the final scores at the result you'll get a higher score because the lower scores have dropped out. Attrition is usually not a serious threat unless the study goes on for a long time or unless the treatment is so demanding that it results in low-performing participants dropping out. So that's the mortality or attrition threat to internal validity. Now there is what is referred to as a selection-maturation interaction of subjects. And this refers to the mixing or combining of separate elements based on different maturational levels. So this is like the differential selection, but here you have two groups, let's say, an experimental and a control group, but maturationally they're different. Their maturational levels are different. So if you draw a group of subjects from one school to serve as a treatment group, and a second group from a different school to serve as a control group, we may find, beyond the simple problem of selection differences between groups, are the two groups equivalent, we may find a mixing of selection and maturation factors to compound the extraneous influences on our measurements. So one group may be more mature, may have better aptitudes and things like that. So if two schools differ in the average age of their members, they may well respond to the treatment differently due to inherent maturational levels. Again, the way to deal with this selection-maturation effect is random assignment to groups. But again, in educational research, at times that is very difficult. But that is the selection-maturation effect. The next effect is the experimenter effect. And it's the term used to describe subtle cues or signals from the experimenter that affect the performance of participants in the studies. And the cues may be unconscious, nonverbal cues, such as muscular tension, gestures, smiles, vocal cues, such as tone of voice, personal characteristics of the researcher, the gender, the race, the age, the position of the researcher. All of these can be ways of presenting threats to the internal validity. So those are referred to as experimenter effects. Then there are subject effects, and this refers to the subject's attitudes towards the research or the researchers. And there are some interesting examples in the field of industrial psychology. The Hawthorne effect comes from, I believe it was a motor plant in the Midwest that was studying the effects of lighting, the amount of lighting and production on the production line, on the assembly line. And what the researchers found out and referred to as the Hawthorne effect as, no matter what they did with the lights, if they dimmed them real low, if they had them really bright, if it were in the middle, that the subjects performed better, no matter what they did. And what it was is the subject realized that they were in a research study, and so they were trying to act. They were trying to act like they thought the researcher wanted them to act. That's referred to as the Hawthorne effect. And then there's the John Henry effect, which is another typical one, and that's called compensatory rivalry. And then there's compensatory demoralization. But all of these result in the subject's attitudes towards the researcher or researchers and how the subjects think the researchers are expecting them to respond, or they may get annoyed because they think that the experimental group is getting extra treatment, and so they're going to screw up the study, and so they don't perform like they should. But these are all subject effects that can be threats to internal validity. And our final one is called diffusion. Diffusion occurs when participants in one group, and it's usually the experimental group, communicate information about the treatment to subjects in the control group in such a way as to influence the control group's behavior. So a teacher may have two classrooms, and one teacher is using teaching method A and the other one is using teaching method B, and the one using teaching method A is all excited about the teaching method and is talking to the other teacher about how wonderful this teaching method A is. And this then may influence the performance of the other teacher who's doing teaching method B, and then this could interfere with the results that are gotten in terms of a change in the dependent variable, or what is being measured. So when participants share or communicate information about the treatment to subjects in the control group, this is referred to as diffusion. Well, okay, those are the threats. Here are items 8 to 14, and they ask you to identify potential threats to internal validity in each of the following scenarios. So a teacher wanted to, this is number 8, a teacher wanted to investigate the effectiveness of new teaching materials designed to increase students' math skills. One of our classes used the conventional materials. Both classes took a math test, skills test at the end of the semester. So what might be some of possible threats to internal validity of that study? So go through each of them, and again, put all of your responses into the one document for this total assignment, and then email me the results. Here are the resources used, and thank you very much for your time. And it's 21 minutes, almost 22. I'm getting a little bit better. But thank you. See you in the next video.